Greetings from my home study in Pittsburgh, PA. I want to talk with you a bit today about the term project, your ethnographic study of a typical recurrent meeting, a typical recurrent situation in your organization. And what I'd like you to have at hand is this handout that I've posted in week 5 entitled Culture, Semiotics, and Rhetoric. This handout elucidates the relationship that I'm trying to articulate between culture and rhetoric, and then rhetoric and semiotics. So you might want to have that in front of you. I'm going to read from it, and then I'm going to also make some comments about this. This handout is an attempt to give you a way to think through how to look very closely at the meeting that you're observing. And remember, I want you to pick a typical recurrent meeting that you're not in charge of, because it's going to be important for you to take field notes and to make some of the observations about the visual and linguistic components of the meeting that you're studying in order to do an ethnography. So I'll begin with culture. A culture is a group that shares stable and enduring meanings. My colleague Robert Scavira came up with that definition, and I like that. The term originates in cultural anthropology. The culture of a people is an ensemble of texts, themselves ensembles, which the anthropologist strains to read over the shoulders of those to whom they properly belong. This is a statement by Clifford Geertz from his article Deep Play about the Balinese cockfight, to which I've referred a number of times. Texts, in Geertz's definition, include written documents as well as recurrent situations or scenes where events occur. In other words, it's an exploded view of the notion of text. It's not just written language on paper or in an electronic format. It is important to underline the primacy of events to understand a culture, since events, especially recurrent events, are the sites of the sharing of and transmission of cultural values, beliefs, and norms. As particular texts, and remember we're talking about texts in this expanded way, become charged with particular meanings, they become artifacts, which I'm going to discuss below, which are anchored in group identifications. Though artifacts may be challenged or even abandoned over time, nevertheless, they enable a culture to share meanings which are stable and enduring. Semiotics, I define it as how we make and communicate meaning through a shared cultural code. And by shared cultural code, I mean not just language, which is a cultural code, but think, for example, about stop signs on a highway. That's a shared cultural code. When you pull up to a particular sign that's hexagonal and red and has in white letters, capital letters, S-T-O-P, we know that we're supposed to accelerate through, correct? No, of course not. I mean, some of us do sort of roll through stop signs, but stop means you bring the car to a stop, and so on and so forth. And then there is a plethora of other signs that would constitute what I would call the code of highway rules and regulations. And every state has these, and of course we have them on the interstates, and they've been standardized throughout the country. So by a shared cultural code, I'm referring to all sorts of different codes, not just language codes, but images and colors and shapes and so on and so forth that have come to mean something significant in our culture. Number one, cultures are highly complex and overlapping. Barry Brummett says this in Rhetoric and Popular Culture, and we participate in a variety of cultures. Now, in our textbook, we've moved to the place now where Hartman is discussing cultures as important sites of ethical inquiry and activity. It's possible to talk about a U.S. culture that has broad, sweeping values, beliefs, and norms, but it is also possible to talk about regional cultures within the United States, or any country. In the United States, we talk about Southern culture, or West Coast culture, or East Coast culture. In addition, it is possible to talk about culture more locally, according to Clifford Geertz, including, for example, the culture of particular institutions like schools, universities, churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, companies, or law courts. All of these local institutions, in order to function, communicate meaning through systems of artifacts anchored in group identifications. Brummett again. In culture, every entity can become a semiotic phenomenon. The laws of signification are the laws of culture. For this reason, culture allows a continuous process of communicative exchanges, insofar as it subsists as a system of systems of signification. Then in italics, culture can be studied completely under a semiotic profile. And this is where linguists and philosophers like Umberto Eco and Roland Barthes have so much in common with cultural anthropologists like Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz actually is doing semiotics, because he coined the term interpretive anthropology, which means you have to look at the signs of a particular culture in order to understand meanings. And you have to look at the system of codes within a culture to understand how and what particular signs mean. Semiotics itself, again, comes from the Greek semeia, which means signs or flags. Number 2, under semiotics, cultures entail consciousness or ideologies, an interrelated system of meanings that are generated by the system of artifacts that comprise a culture. Brummett again, Rhetoric and Popular Culture. Here, ideology should not be understood in the classic Marxist sense as a false set of ideas and meanings that hide the true nature of an institution. Rather, ideology should be understood as a world and life view constituted of values, beliefs, and norms. While a dominant group in a given culture may be influential in creating and maintaining these values, beliefs, and norms, nevertheless, the systems of meanings need not be understood as a lie or false, except perhaps in the way Nietzsche understood it, and on truth and lies in a non-moral sense, or an eco sense that the study of semiotics is first and foremost a study of the lie, which is the human drive to represent and misrepresent reality symbolically. So ideology here basically means that any given culture, whether we're talking about the United States or a particular corporation, has this kind of unified way that the meanings of words and actions are interpreted. People who believe in, participate in a given culture may openly embrace the ideology or critique the ideology, but for communication to occur, there must be a shared set of meanings for the culture. A number of you have already shared in our discussions throughout the last few weeks about what your corporate culture or what your nonprofit culture, your institution's culture looks like, and what's valued by it, what's believed by it, and so on and so forth. And this is what we mean by ideology. Number 3, cultures are experienced through texts, which are smaller interrelated sets of signs and artifacts. A text is a set of signs related to each other. So these typical recurrent meetings that I'm having you study ethnographically is really what Clifford Geertz, Roland Barthes, Umberto Eco, and other semioticians would call a text, a cultural text. And the only way to make sense of a culture is to pick small pieces of it, as Geertz did the Balinese cockfight, or Roland Barthes did professional wrestling, and to see if you can make sense of that particular text, that typical recurrent event, because it's going to have embedded in it the values and beliefs of the particular culture. Text, again, here must be understood not exclusively as a written document, rather as events, situations, or scenes. Thus, a college class like the one that you're taking right now is a text, as is a football game or a presidential inauguration. A text can be discrete, like this handout that I'm reading from, or diffuse, like Christmas or Halloween. A small manufacturing business, for example, as a culture, will exhibit a variety of texts, board meetings, inventories, management meetings, job interviews, employer-employee conferences, the lunchroom, working on the floor, order picking and filling, etc., etc. As far as a given culture is concerned, events or situations are the primary sites of cultural activities, and events or situations as texts can be read in quotation marks, semiotically. Fourth, in addition, everything is a sign, and this is where you get down to the fundamental unit of semiotic analysis, a sign. That's because a sign is something that induces you to think about something other than itself. And everything has that potential. Barry Brummett again. Aristotle defined a sign as aliquid stat pro aliquo, something that stands for something else. And signs, as understood from Peirce to Eco, exhibit different meanings or modes. 3 have been identified: indexical, which are associational or causal meanings; iconic, where something resembles something else, as in a photograph; and symbolic meaning. All words, for example, stand for something else. And language is the perfect example of symbolic meaning. So let's see if we can do this with the American flag, which we all know is a cultural sign, right? It stands for something other than itself, and it's also an artifact. It's become charged with meaning for American people, and even though American people might respond to it differently, nevertheless it is this sign. So the phrase, and whenever I have those slashes there, I'm talking about that particular phrase. The American flag uses the conventions of standard written English to communicate its meanings. This example of symbolic meaning is conventional, as is most symbolic meaning, because the 26 letters of the English alphabet have been accepted as the set of symbols used in the United States for written communication. So symbolic meaning here doesn't have to do with finding all of the symbols in The Great Gatsby, you know, the ever-present eye of T.J. Eckelberg that you see in that novel. We're not talking about symbols in this sense. We're talking about sets of codes like the 26 letters in an alphabet, or when you're writing Java or any other computer code, you have to use the particular set and subsets of letters and numbers and so on for the code to work. And earlier I referred to the set of meanings that we call the driver's code, which includes all of the different types of signs that we find on the road. So that's symbolic meaning. A photograph or drawing of the American flag, or the red, white, and blue, for example, of Tommy Hilfiger advertisements, are iconic signs of the flag, but begin to shade into indexical meanings associated with the flag. Meanings for Americans as concrete as the Star-Spangled Banner, or as abstract as the notions of freedom or liberty. Iconic and indexical meanings are less conventional and require more abduction or interpretation or inference to understand meaning. It is important to note, though, that these meanings, symbolic, iconic, and indexical, are not to be understood as types and are not necessarily mutually exclusive. A map, for example, is indexical in pointing to the location of things, iconic in representing the directional relations and distances between landmarks, and symbolic in using conventional symbols that signify the significance of which must be learned. You know, take a little time and think about that, about a road map, and how it contains all 3 modes of semiosis. It contains the symbolic, the iconic, and indexical signs and meanings associated with them. Metaphors, for example, operate chiefly by way of association indexically. My love is like a red, red rose, Bobby Burns' old phrase. You've got to understand the metaphor, you've got to infer both the similarities between a rose and love, you know, delicate, tender, fragrant, etc., and the differences, emotion versus plant, mental phenomenon versus organic material. But by convention and usage, the red road has become a symbol of love in the West. And the sight of an actual red rose, or iconic representation of a red rose, induces one to think about romantic love. In the end, there are probably no pure icons, since there is always an element of convention involved. Bobby Burns' poem was set to music numerous times in the 18th and 19th centuries, and has been in the canon of British literature for over 200 years, and is thus deeply embedded in the consciousness of English-speaking people. Number 6, still under semiotics. Signs become artifacts as they become charged with meaning, thus crossing a threshold into artifact status. And, according to Brummett, an artifact can be defined as 1. An action, event, or object perceived as a unified whole. 2. Having widely shared meanings. And 3. Manifesting group identifications to us. The cross, for example, is an artifact for Christians, but not for Muslims or Jews. The cross represents an event that took place for Christians, and it is perceived as a unified whole. The death of Christ on the cross is perceived as the salvation event for the faith. It has widely shared meanings for all Christians, because Jesus' death has this universal implication for Christians involving, once again, salvation. And because people wear crosses and put crosses in their cars and in their homes, and they observe them in churches, the cross manifests a kind of group identification when it's not just being worn as jewelry, which is true for many people. The cross, as I said, is an artifact for Christians, but not for Muslims or Jews. 50 Cent is an artifact for hip-hop culture, but not for devotees of Mozart. The American flag is an artifact for citizens of the United States, but not for Canadians. And our red, red rose is an artifact of romantic love for English-speaking people, but not for Aborigines in the outback of Australia. Number 7, under semiotics. From all of the above, it now makes sense that every culture contains its own method for understanding its artifacts. The cultural anthropologist, the semiotician, and rhetorician all strain over the shoulders of the members of a particular culture in order to read the texts of the culture, not from the point of view of the scholar, but from the point of view of the members of the culture. Geertz writes, societies, like lives, contain their own interpretation. One has only to learn how to gain access to them. And in here I have a little note saying that we need to think about ethnocentric versus culture-centered approaches to criticism. In other words, we want to be able to look at cultures, and Hartman has made this point in the text time and time again, on their own territory and within their own terms, and originally at least refrained from judging cultures that are different from our own. And I want to argue that this approach, and Hartman's arguing it too, and it's one of the reasons I've chosen the textbook, works for studying corporate culture. And one of the best ways of getting at what's going on morally and ethically in a particular corporation and its culture is to look very closely at typical recurrent events, meetings, and situations, which is what your term project is all about. And finally, on page 3 of this handout, I talk a little bit about rhetoric, which is actually my full field of study. And I define rhetoric here as how we manipulate meaning to influence people and situations. And I quote Brummett again because I really like his definition of rhetoric. He says that rhetoric is the human use of signs to influence people. And again now, Brummett isn't just talking about words. He's talking about signs, particular signs. He's talking about texts and the ways and artifacts, objects that, that are used to influence people. If this is the case, if this is what rhetoric is, and I believe that it is, then rhetoric enables us to see how people who share a particular cultural code attempt to get other people to identify with their projects and perspectives. And that goes back to a rhetorician named Kenneth Berg. Moreover, rhetoric itself is always situated, or as Lloyd Bitzer argues, is a natural context of persons, events, objects, relations, and an exigence, which invites the utterance. And he's speaking here primarily, almost exclusively actually, of the spoken word. This invited response participates naturally in the situation, is in many instances necessary to the completion of situational activity, and by means of its participation with the situation, obtains its meaning and its rhetorical character. Bitzer identifies 6 important implications of understanding rhetoric as situated. Now, I'm not going to read over these. These are at the bottom of page 3 of your handout. But the point that Bitzer is making in this article entitled The Rhetorical Situation is that whenever we talk about the ways in which signs influence people, we're talking about specific local recurrent situation. And these situations are everything from a presidential inaugural address to a football game to having people over for a football game. We tend to surround ourselves with signs and texts that tell something about how we view this particular event. I don't know about you, but when I watch a Steelers game, I have to get dressed up in battle gear. I haven't gotten the stuff out this year yet because the Steelers are doing terribly. But I do have a number 43 Hines Ward game jersey. I have a terrible towel. I have a hat, and so on and so forth. So when we get prepared to watch the Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening or Monday night or Wednesday night or Thursday night, I guess football happens pretty much every night of the week now. And then you can, of course, watch any past games on any and all of these ESPN channels, both college, professional, and even high school now. Anyways, so watching a football game together is a typical recurrent situation for football fans. And here in Pittsburgh, most of us know that that it's a pretty important activity. In fact, I have a book on ethics where the writer uses the Pittsburgh Steelers as a test case to see whether or not football is actually a religion, especially in Pittsburgh. So I hope you're getting the sense of what we're talking about here, because I share this handout with you and this little bit about semiotics and rhetoric to help you to think not only in terms of what's going on linguistically in the room, what people are saying, but to think more about how the room is set up. Who sits where? Who comes in early? Who comes in late? How far are the chairs apart? Where is the leader seated? Is the table round? Is it rectangular? Is it an oval? Are the chairs set up and facing a lone speaker, or is there more of a sense participation? This moves us into some really interesting observations about how the meeting then is actually run, because the way we set up in a room is often indicative of the way in which we perceive power distance and power relationships. Further, when you sit down into this room and people are assembling, what are they doing? You know, a number of you have talked about all the texting that goes on. What's it like to be in a room where people are carrying on conversations with other people via email or texting? In addition, look around the room carefully and see what's on the walls. You know, why You know, why are these things on the walls? What's the technological setup? Is it a smart room? Does it have a smart board? Does it have a computer and a projector? No doubt it will. Does the person utilize PowerPoint, which has become the industry standard for oral presentations, and so on and so forth? So take a little time, read over this this handout that I've given you, and Hartman's going to be giving you more clues about what he thinks an ethical community looks like, what he thinks constitutes a good community. And you might want to skip ahead and take a look at what he says in Chapter 7, when he says that the 3 characteristics of a good community involve exit, loyalty, and voice. Those 3 elements we'll talk a lot about in week 7, but he's been foreshadowing where he wants to go with this. And of course, this is why I've included this term project, because I want you to, rather than talking about ethics in the abstract, I wanted you to look more closely at your own organization and ask whether or not a good community is being built, whether or not people who have varying world life views and varying understandings of what constitutes the good life are somehow made a part of this in our increasingly secular and pluralist culture. So I hope this helps, and if you have any questions, bring them up in our discussions or send me an email. Take care.